Welcome to Building Your First Recipe. When building your recipe, the first essential part is to connect your applications to Workato.
For every app that your recipe interacts with, Workato needs to be authorized to communicate with the apps on your behalf. Take, for example, the ticket escalation automation that was shown earlier. Workato needs to be authorized to connect with all three applications: Salesforce, Jira, and Slack. Workato uses the app's API, and it may require OAuth-based authorization, API keys, or other authorization methods. This authorization is referred to as an application connection. Authorization options include Basic Auth, OAuth 2, JSON Web Token, Header Auth, and SAML 2. However, there are some applications with custom authentication flows. You may refer to the Workato documentation on how to connect to different applications. Let's now look at how to connect our applications to Workato when we are building a recipe. To build a recipe from scratch, click on Create a new recipe, and Workato will first prompt you to set up your recipe by giving it a name. You will also be asked to select the destination folder to store the recipe. This helps keep your recipes organized. Next, you will be prompted to pick a starting point for your recipe. The starting point provides a quick and easy access to the different types of trigger options that you can build on Workato. We will cover more on them as we go along. If we are building a recipe which will be executed when there's an event in an application, let's select Trigger from an app. Once you have clicked on Start Building, it will take you to the Recipe Editor, where you can build your recipe and configure the workflow that you want. The left side of the Recipe Editor displays the recipe workflow, while the right side allows you to configure the trigger and actions of your recipe. As we configure each of these triggers and actions, whenever it involves an application, we will need to establish the connection to the corresponding application. Take, for example, if our trigger is going to be from Salesforce. We will first select the application Salesforce as well as the trigger, such as New Updated Record. Thereafter, you will be prompted to connect to your application. Any active connections will be displayed in this section. If there are no existing connections, it will prompt you to create a new connection. First, input a unique name for the connection, such as MyDev Salesforce. Next, click on Connect, and you will be prompted to connect to your Salesforce account with your Salesforce login credentials. Once done, a connection is established and Workato now has permission to access the data in your Salesforce account. You can then proceed to configure the rest of your trigger or actions. Each connection corresponds to one application instance. Hence, multiple recipes can and should utilize the same connection if they are working with the same application instance. To see all the connections that we have in the account or team, go to the App Connections tab in the navigation bar. You may also create folders to organize the connections. The next building block of a recipe is the trigger. Let us now take a closer look at how a recipe gets triggered, what a trigger is, and the various types of triggers. Triggers determine what event to listen to in order to execute the actions described in a recipe. There are many types of triggers, and we can classify them according to their trigger mechanism, dispatch, or event type. There are three types of trigger mechanisms: polling, real-time, and scheduled triggers. Triggers dispatch differently too, which can give you one or multiple records to process. The basic trigger processes events or records one at a time, while batch bulk triggers process events in groups. Lastly, you can select the trigger event that will set off your recipe on a create, update, or delete. Sometimes you can select both created and updated as the trigger event.
When building your trigger in the Workato platform, after you have selected the application, you will be prompted to select the trigger. Workato has made it easy for users to be able to differentiate the different types of trigger mechanism by showing an icon beside the triggers.
There are icons for real-time triggers and batch processing. Those without icons are polled triggers. A time-scheduled trigger uses the Workato application called Scheduler by Workato. In this app, you can set the time at which your recipe will run. Let's get into the details. So how do triggers work? It is very important to understand these trigger concepts. These features, automatically available with Workato Smart Triggers, are what set us apart from the competition. Because we take care of these behind the scenes, you don't have to. In-sequence delivery means trigger events will be processed in the same order as when the events were created or modified. There will be no duplicates of trigger events as it is only processed once. Workato will reject the event if the sending system sends a duplicate event. Flow control of jobs is guaranteed when using a higher concurrency. When you set the concurrency to a higher value, multiple jobs can be processed concurrently and trigger events are processed synchronously. All events are guaranteed to be delivered once and only once. Even when the server is down or unstable, data will not be lost, as events will always get picked up when the server is stable and running due to the cursor position, and it can thus resume from where it stopped. This is possible because Workato maintains a durable cursor position that points to the last record processed. So if Workato stops a recipe at 11 p.m. and then starts the recipe again next morning at 8 a.m., it is able to pick up jobs in between this time gap. Records will be processed in the original ascending order. Let's dive deeper into each trigger mechanism to understand them better. Polling triggers in Workato will check the application for new events. Depending on the available API, Workato can receive trigger events periodically by polling the app. The frequency is dependent on the type of plan each user has in Workato, and it can go as low as 5 minutes and up to 30 minutes. When starting your recipe for the first time, the polling trigger will fetch all events from the date and time that you have set. However, this can only be set once. You may select the point at which your trigger will fetch events from either from a list or a specific date and time. If this needs to be changed, a copy of the recipe is required to reset the parameter. Each poll can generate multiple jobs, with each job corresponding to each record or event. Users choose polling triggers when they do not need immediate response or service level agreement. Polls have to minimally wait for 5 minutes. If you want to check for jobs immediately, you can just click on the Check Now button seen in the Jobs tab on your recipe. This will accelerate the polling for this cycle. Let's move on to real-time triggers. This is built on top of asynchronous notification mechanism, which means that the recipe will process the data that is delivered by the app in whatever sequence it chooses to. This will usually require registration in the connected application via API or manually through the app interface. Each time the application has new or updated events, it will inform Workato straight away. Webhooks are one such mechanism. Most real-time triggers supported on Workato are built on webhooks. The advantage of webhooks are that there is no delay. The event is processed the moment it is generated, and it is good for cases where SLAs matter. It is more efficient as we only receive notifications from apps when events occur, instead of Workato having to check at regular intervals for new event. The Workato scheduler-based trigger forces the recipe to wake up and perform the actions at specified intervals or at specified times. At the scheduled time or interval, this trigger will fetch all records or events matching the specified criteria. Events that have already been picked up previously will be returned. The events are returned in batches, where users can specify the maximum batch size. For example, if the batch size is set to 100 and 420 new events are identified, 5 new jobs will be created. The first 4 jobs will have 100 events each, and the 5th will have 20 events. Workato supports special scheduled triggers for various applications such as Salesforce, Workday, ServiceNow, or SQL Server. When configuring a scheduled trigger for an application, take for example Workday. When you want to schedule a report run, you can configure the schedule as hourly, daily, and monthly. Choose the time zone and the exact timing that you want the trigger to fetch the event. Also, unlike other triggers, scheduled triggers may return events that have already been picked up previously. You can control this by specifying the selection criteria properly. In addition, you can also use Scheduler by Workato to schedule when exactly your recipe will run. When starting from scratch, you can make use of Run on a Schedule as your recipe starting point to access Scheduler by Workato. In addition, you can also search for the app Scheduler by Workato in the trigger. There are two types of trigger events to choose from. The first one is New Scheduled Event. This trigger allows you to specify the interval at which the recipe should run and its start time. The other one is the Advanced New Scheduled Event, which allows you to specify the specific day and time in which you want the recipe to run. Input fields include the time zone, the exact hour and minute, as well as days of the week. If you specify only the minutes, for example 30, the recipe will trigger 24 times a day, every 30 minutes past the hour. If both hour and minute input fields are filled, the recipe will trigger once a day. In this case, the recipe will trigger at 11:30 a.m. once a day. Now that we have looked at the various trigger mechanisms, let us look at the types of trigger dispatch. Single triggers and batch bulk triggers. Trigger dispatches determine whether a trigger returns a single event or a list of events. In this section, we cover single triggers and batch triggers. Single triggers are useful for continuous real-time synchronization of data. For example, moving opportunities from Salesforce into NetSuite as sales orders the moment these opportunities close. Most Workato triggers are single triggers. Batch triggers are generally used for increasing throughput, as trigger events are retrieved in lists instead of single events. For example, moving high volume of user activity data from Workato into data warehouses like Redshift. If processing efficiency is the goal, it is advisable to use batch processing actions throughout the recipe actions. For example, writing in batch to the target system, using collections to do batch data manipulation. The image on the left does not do batch processing. One transaction is one job in Workato. To process the set of 18 records, there will be 18 jobs. The image on the right shows batching, which will have fewer jobs. If the batch size is 5 rows per batch, there will only be a total of 4 jobs if you have 18 records. In reality, batch sizes are 200 or above. Batch triggers will have one job to process multiple rows of data or multiple records. Larger batch size means fewer jobs and fewer API calls. Fewer jobs is good, as it consumes less tasks for the user. Not all applications support batch processing APIs. Most cloud apps support batch processing: Salesforce, database connectors, cloud storage connectors, file connectors. For best results, always match a batch trigger with batch actions. We will cover this in future modules. So what are the components of a trigger and how do we configure a trigger? Different triggers require different sets of inputs. The required and optional fields for each trigger will show once you select the desired trigger.
To configure a trigger, you will first have to select the application which will trigger the recipe, the type of trigger that you require, followed by the connection to use and optionally, the since from parameter. The since from parameter determines whether the recipe will process historical data starting from a specified date or only process trigger events moving forward. In this case, since we selected the option an hour ago, the recipe will only process opportunities that were created or updated an hour ago onwards. Since from value can only be set once, and you cannot change it once the recipe has been started. Depending on your needs, you may also choose to set up trigger conditions or trigger filters, which will allow you to reduce the records processed based on certain criteria. We will touch upon this later on. Now let's look at another essential building block of a recipe: actions. Since a recipe can have various types of actions, let's get an overview of actions in a recipe. You can perform a subset of the CRUD actions against an app. These are the create, read, update, and delete. For some apps, you also have upsert actions. Workato is also able to search for data in the application, then update it, depending on the recipe workflow. You can also have different conditional steps under actions, such as if statement or if-else statements. You can use a repeat step to loop through lists of items in your recipe. Error monitor action is similar to try-catch statements and can be used to trap and gracefully handle any unforeseen errors.
The stop job action ends a single job from being processed any further. And lastly, we have call recipe step, which is to call other callable recipes in your Workato account. Similar to the trigger processing, actions can process a single record or event or a batch of events. With data mapping, users are able to map data from incoming records or intermediate steps into different fields of the current action. In addition to simple data mapping, you can use a plethora of formulas and make use of lookup tables. We will be looking at each one closely in the rest of this course. Adding actions to your recipe is simple on Workato. By clicking on the plus sign, you would be able to add different actions, including action in an app, if and if-else conditions, repeat action, call recipe, stop job, as well as handle errors. To add an action in an app, you would have to select your application. Once selected, the list of available actions supported for the app has to be selected. For example, you will select Salesforce and then create records to configure your action. Every application has an available set of actions which differ across connectors and will generally include create, update, upsert, search, get, delete, etc. Besides external applications, there are also built-in utility actions by Workato, where some apps can be used to help users with the building of recipes. Built-in apps such as CSV, callable recipes, charts, collections, and email by Workato are commonly used applications. Other tools such as JavaScript and Ruby are available to execute your code. Let's now take a look at how to configure an action. Check that you are working on the recipe editor. If you are not, click on the Edit Recipe button to access the recipe editor. This allows the user to add actions based on the application they use. Similar to a trigger, what needs to be set up in an action is dependent on the application and the action type selected. In general, one has to select the application in which the action will be executed and the action type. The info box tells you what the action does and, when applicable, links you to relevant documentation for more information. Going into Setup, you will then further define the parameters of the actions through the required and optional input fields, where required fields are marked with an asterisk. For the other actions such as if and if-else conditions, repeat action, stop job, and handle errors, we will delve into that later on. Now, we will look at how to run a recipe. Once you have built your recipes, deploying them is fast. In Workato, you can work with recipes in various ways. Inside the recipe editor, click on the Test button to run a single trigger event through the recipe logic. This will continuously run until one job is picked up. This lets you review the job details to check for recipe corrections that might be needed. If your recipe is working well and you want to run it, simply exit the test job report and click on the Start Recipe button. This allows the recipe to pick up all trigger events and will continue to listen for trigger events unless explicitly stopped. Clicking on the Stop Recipe button will stop processing new trigger events. Now that we have learnt the main building blocks of a recipe, we will next try building our first recipe.